We all think we know the story of Cain and Abel, right? It's pretty much the first story we learn about jealousy and sin. But the murder itself isn't the biggest mystery. The real mystery is what happened next. Because when you dig deeper, the Bible hints at a secret wife, this really enigmatic mark from God, and a whole city built by a man who was condemned to wander the earth. So yeah, the crime is just the beginning. The real story is everything that comes after. What actually happened to Cain? The answers, and there are a lot of them, kind of change how you view the very beginning of humanity. And that's what we're going to unpack right now. Okay, so to really get this, we have to go back to the very beginning. And what's wild is that this whole tragedy doesn't start with murder. It actually starts with hope. A really flawed and ultimately tragic hope. See, when Cain was born, his mother Eve seemed to think he might be the one, the promised redeemer spoken of back in the Garden of Eden. I mean, just listen to the weight behind Eve's words here. She says, "I have gotten a man from the Lord." It's entirely possible she genuinely believed her firstborn son was the prophesied Messiah, the one who would finally crush the head of the serpent. Can you imagine that level of expectation? It sets up this incredible, hope-filled premise that is just about to go so horribly wrong. And this is where the tragedy gets baked right into his name. In Hebrew, Cain, or Cain, means possession or acquisition. Eve saw her son as this gift she'd acquired from God. But here's the kicker. Cain also sounds a whole lot like the Hebrew word for spear. The very name of the boy they hoped would be a redeemer actually carried this dark hint of the violence he was about to bring into the world. All right, so that hope is just hanging in the air. But then we get to the massive turning point of the story, the two offerings. This is where everything starts to unravel. You've got two brothers, two altars, but it's God's reaction that really sets this tragic chain of events in motion. So what was the big deal? Why did God accept one and not the other? Well, it all boils down to their attitude. Cain brought the fruit of the ground, basically the product of his own hard work. It was like he was saying, "Here, God, look what I did, you should accept it." But Abel, he brought a blood sacrifice from the very best of his flock. It was an act of faith and active obedience to the model God required. The book of Hebrews later says Abel offered his sacrifice by faith, and that right there made all the difference. And you can just see the dominoes start to fall right here. This wasn't some isolated incident. That one rejected offering, it led to jealousy. Jealousy festered into anger, and that anger exploded into the world's first murder, which then led directly to Cain's exile and judgment. It just goes to show how one bad attitude, one wrong posture of the heart can spiral into complete and utter ruin. So now we get to the aftermath. The terrible deed is done. Cain has committed this unthinkable act. And God's response? Well, it's one of the most mysterious and honestly paradoxical moments in all of Scripture. It's a punishment for sure, but it's also something else entirely. I mean, you really have to try and wrap your head around this. This was the first time a human had ever killed another. The Bible puts it so powerfully. It says Abel's blood literally cried out from the ground. For the first time, the earth, which was made to give life, was stained by human violence. Creation itself was groaning under the weight of this crime. And that leads us to maybe the most famous mystery in this whole story. What exactly was the mark of Cain? The Bible is totally silent on what it looked like. Was it a scar, a horn, some kind of glowing symbol? We have no idea. And maybe that's the point. Because while we don't know the what, we're told very clearly about the why. Its purpose was crystal clear. And this is where it gets really complex. The mark was a total paradox. On one hand, it was a brand, a sign of God's judgment that forever marked him as a murderer. But at the same time, it was this weird act of divine mercy. It protected him, preventing anyone from killing him and starting a cycle of revenge. So he was spared death, but he was condemned to live, to wander as an untouchable outcast with the full, crushing weight of his guilt. So Cain is now this marked man, cursed to just wander. That's his sentence. But what does he do? In this incredible act of defiance, he does the one thing he wasn't supposed to. He puts down roots. Just think about the contrast here. He's leaving the world of Eden, which was all about being in God's presence, and he's exiled to the land of Nod. Now, Nod in Hebrew literally means wandering, so it's not just a place on a map, it's a state of being, a spiritual desert defined by God's absence, by his silence. And what does he do in this land of wandering? He builds a city. This is a monumental act of defiance. He's creating permanence, a legacy for himself. And notice who he names it after. His son, Enoch, not after God. This is the very beginning of a civilization centered entirely on humanity's achievements, not on divine communion.
And out of this city comes this really complicated, fascinating legacy. Cain's descendants, wow, they become these amazing cultural pioneers, but that violence, that rebellion from their founder, it's in their DNA. I mean, look at what comes from his line. You've got Jabal, who basically invents ranching and nomadic living. Then there's Jubal, the father of music and art. And Tubal-Cain, the first guy to work with metal to forge tools and weapons out of brass and iron. We're talking shelter, art, technology, the very building blocks of civilization, all springing from this cursed line. But with all that incredible progress, the moral darkness gets deeper too. And Cain's descendant Lamech is the perfect, chilling example. He doesn't just repeat Cain's sin of murder, he boasts about it. He turns violence into a song of pride, bragging that if God would avenge Cain 7 times, well, he'll be avenged 77 times. The sin hasn't just been repeated, it's been magnified and celebrated.
So you have this civilization that's brilliant, innovative, and incredibly violent. Where does it all lead? Well, this brings us to the final chapter for Cain's lineage, the ultimate judgment on a world that tried to build itself without God. First, and this is really haunting, there's just silence. The Bible never tells us how Cain died. For a man who so desperately tried to build a permanent legacy, his end is simply oblivion. He is erased from the sacred record, a punishment of being utterly forgotten. And that silence sets up this powerful final contrast. You have Cain's legacy, the city. It was all about human pride, self-sufficiency, and defiance. And in parallel, you have the legacy of Seth, the line that replaced Abel. Their legacy culminated in Noah building an ark, a vessel of faith and obedience. And in the end, when the judgment came, well, the city sank, but the ark floated. So when you look at the whole story, from that tragic hope at his birth to the complete erasure of everything he built, it leaves us with this huge, timeless question. It really makes you wonder, after all the art, all the innovation, and all the effort to build something permanent, is it truly possible to create a lasting legacy without a divine foundation?